Emperor Valin of the Karath Empire had ruled 70 star systems for over 1,000 years. In all that time, he had learned one unchangeable truth about power: everyone lies to those who hold it. Advisors told him what he wanted to hear. Generals exaggerated their victories. Diplomats hid their true intentions behind practiced smiles. But servants, he discovered long ago, revealed their authentic selves when they believed no one was watching. That is why Valin developed his test. Once every few months, he would dismiss his guards, lie down in his private rest chamber, and pretend to sleep. Then he would watch, through barely opened eyes, as the cleaning staff went about their duties. What he witnessed during these tests always disappointed him. Servants would mock him under their breath, complaining about his demands or his appearance. Some would pocket small items they thought he would not miss. Others would rush through their work, leaving dust in corners and grime on surfaces they assumed he would never inspect personally. Tonight promised to be different, though Valin expected it would disappoint him just the same. His head servant, an elderly human woman named Dorothy, had fallen ill with one of those brief sicknesses that plagued her species. Her daughter had volunteered to cover the evening shift in the Imperial Rest Chamber. Valin had met this daughter only once, months ago, when Dorothy first brought her to the palace for training. The girl had kept her eyes down, spoken only when addressed, and seemed terrified of making any mistake. Her name was Beth, and she was young by human standards, perhaps 25 years old. Valin positioned himself on his rest platform, a massive structure carved from a single piece of obsidian that had been transported from his conquered homeworld. The chamber itself reflected his personality, cold, dark, and imposing. Ancient weapons from defeated civilizations hung on the walls. Holographic displays showed real-time data from across his empire. The temperature was kept several degrees below what most species found comfortable, because Valin had stopped noticing cold centuries ago. He slowed his breathing, using techniques he had mastered over millennia. His 4 eyes closed to narrow slits, enough to see but not enough to be noticed. His body became perfectly still. To any observer, he appeared to be in the deep hibernation state that his species required every few cycles. But beneath this facade, every one of his senses remained alert. His biosensors, invisible implants beneath his scaled skin, monitored movement and sound throughout the chamber. His mind stayed sharp, cataloging every detail. The door opened with its usual soft hiss. Beth entered carrying her cleaning supplies in a worn canvas bag. Valin watched her pause just inside the threshold, her hand still on the door control. She stood there for a long moment, and he could see her chest rising and falling with nervous breaths. Through his senses, he detected her elevated heart rate, the slight tremor in her hands. Fear radiated from her in waves that his advanced biology could almost taste. Finally, she stepped fully into the chamber and let the door close behind her. She moved toward the far wall, where she set down her bag with extreme care, making barely any sound. Then she pulled out her cleaning tools one by one: cloths, solutions, polishing compounds. Everything she did was deliberate and quiet, as if she feared waking him from sleep. Valin watched with detached curiosity as she began her work on the weapons display. She cleaned each ancient blade with meticulous attention, treating artifacts that had ended civilizations with the same gentle respect most beings reserved for holy relics. Her hands never shook as she worked, despite the nervousness he had sensed when she first entered. Whatever fear she felt, she controlled it completely when focused on her task. Most servants cleaned this chamber as quickly as possible, eager to leave the presence of the Emperor even when he slept. But Beth moved with careful purpose, taking time with each surface, each object. She worked her way around the room in a logical pattern, never rushing, never cutting corners. Valin found himself almost impressed. Perhaps this test would prove different after all. But he reminded himself not to judge too quickly. The real test came later, when servants thought themselves completely unobserved, when they believed the sleeping emperor could neither see nor hear what they did. That was when truth emerged. That was when he would discover what this human daughter of Dorothy truly thought of the alien tyrant she served. So Valin waited, patient as only a 1,000-year-old emperor could be, curious to see what would happen next in this chamber where so many had failed his test before. Beth continued her methodical cleaning, moving from the weapons display to the shelves that held artifacts from countless conquered worlds. Each item represented a piece of galactic history, most of it violent. A crystallized flower from a planet that no longer existed. A ceremonial mask from a species that had surrendered after a brutal siege. Navigation instruments from ships that had challenged the Karath Empire and lost. These were trophies of domination, reminders of Valin's absolute power. Most servants treated these objects with cold efficiency, dusting them quickly and moving on. But Beth approached each one differently. She would pick up an artifact, examine it closely in the dim light, then clean it with careful attention before returning it to its exact position. Valen noticed she left no fingerprints, no smudges. Her work was flawless. Then she reached the corner shelf, and everything changed. On this shelf sat Valen's most personal possessions, items he rarely acknowledged but could never bring himself to remove. Memory crystals, small translucent objects no bigger than a human thumb, each one containing holographic recordings from his past. Most of these crystals held tactical data, battle strategies, political negotiations, the dry records of empire building. But 3 crystals were different. 3 crystals held something Valen had not looked at in over 200 years, because the pain of viewing them had become unbearable. These 3 crystals contained recordings of his daughter, Lyra. Beth picked up the first crystal, and Valen's heart began to race. Through his biosensors, he could feel his own stress levels rising, threatening to break his facade of sleep. No servant had ever touched these crystals. Dorothy had trained her staff to dust around them, to leave them completely alone. Had she forgotten to tell Beth this crucial instruction? But Beth was not ignoring them. She held the crystal up to the light, and Valen could see her squinting at something on its surface. Then she pulled out a special cloth from her bag, one designed for delicate electronics, and began to clean the crystal with gentle circular motions. The Emperor realized with shock that the crystals had accumulated years of dust, a fine layer that he had stopped noticing long ago. In his grief, he had trained himself not to see them at all. Beth cleaned the first crystal until it gleamed, then carefully set it down and picked up the second one. As she worked, Valen noticed something that made his ancient blood run cold. Her hands were shaking. Not with fear this time, but with something else. She was crying. Silent tears ran down her face as she cleaned these objects whose significance she could not possibly understand. Then the second crystal slipped. It was barely a fumble, just a momentary loss of grip, but it was enough. The crystal tumbled through her fingers, and Beth gasped, catching it against her chest before it could fall. But the damage was done. The motion-activated technology inside the crystal recognized movement and pressure. The crystal activated. A hologram burst into existence above the shelf, filling a 3-foot space with light and color. The image showed a young Karath child, perhaps 8 years old by human equivalent, running through a garden of bioluminescent flowers. Her scales were lighter than her father's, a bright silver blue that sparkled in the garden's twilight. She was laughing, the high-pitched joy of a child at play, as she chased something the recording did not capture. Valen's heart clenched. Lyra. His daughter. Dead for 3 centuries from a plague that had swept through the Karath homeworld, killing millions before scientists found a cure. She had been one of the early victims, gone before her father could even return from his military campaigns to say goodbye. Beth stood frozen, the crystal still pressed against her chest, staring at the hologram with wide eyes. The recording continued playing. Young Lyra stopped running and turned toward the camera, her face bright with excitement. She said something in the ancient Karath language, words that Valen still heard in his dreams. Then she ran forward, her small arms outstretched, calling for her father. The hologram flickered and ended. The crystal had only stored a 20-second clip. In the silence that followed, Valen watched Beth through his barely open eyes, waiting to see what she would do. Would she laugh at the mighty emperor who kept sentimental recordings? Would she gossip about this discovery to other servants? Would she see this as valuable information to sell to his enemies, proof that the fearsome Valen had a weakness? Beth did none of these things. She sank down slowly until she was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, still holding the crystal. Her tears fell faster now, and Valen could hear her breathing become uneven. She raised one hand to her mouth, clearly trying to muffle the sound of her crying. For several minutes, she just sat there, this young human woman, weeping in the private chamber of the galaxy's most powerful ruler. Then she whispered something, so quietly that even Valen's enhanced hearing barely caught it. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She was not apologizing for activating the crystal. She was apologizing to him, to Valen, for his loss. This human, who had every reason to hate the emperor whose conquests had brought her species under alien rule, was crying for his pain. She mourned for a child she had never met, from a species not her own, who had died centuries before Beth was even born. Valen felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 300 years. Beth stayed on the floor for several more minutes, composing herself. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, took several deep breaths, then slowly stood up. She placed the memory crystal back on the shelf with extraordinary care, positioning it exactly where it had been. Then she finished cleaning the remaining crystal, her movements even more gentle than before. Valen expected her to leave after that. Her shift was technically over. The chamber was spotless, every surface gleaming. Any reasonable servant would gather their supplies and exit as quietly as possible, grateful to escape the Emperor's presence. That is what anyone else would have done. Beth did not leave. Instead, she walked toward Valen's rest platform. The Emperor's entire body tensed beneath his facade of sleep. His hand moved fractionally closer to the concealed weapon built into the platform's frame. Was this it? Had the tears been an act? Was she an assassin after all, sent by one of the rebellion groups that constantly plotted his downfall? It would not be the first time someone had tried to kill him in his sleep, though all previous attempts had failed spectacularly. But Beth made no aggressive moves. She stopped beside the platform and simply stood there, looking down at him. Through his narrowed eyes, Valen could see her face clearly. There was no malice there, no calculation. Just that same expression of sadness mixed with something else he could not quite identify. Then she reached into her cleaning bag and pulled out something that made absolutely no sense. It was fabric, worn and faded, clearly old and well used. A blanket. A human blanket, the kind their species used for warmth and comfort. It was dark blue with small white stars printed on it, the pattern faded from many washings. Beth unfolded the blanket and draped it carefully over Valen's massive form. His body was nearly twice the size of a human, his rest platform built to accommodate his bulk, but she adjusted the blanket as best she could, tucking it gently around his shoulders. Her movements were tender, the way a parent might cover a sleeping child. The blanket carried scents that Valen's sensitive nose immediately detected. It smelled like human dwelling spaces, a mixture of laundry soap, cooking spices, and something warm he could not name. It smelled like a home, like comfort, like safety. These were concepts the Emperor had not associated with his own living spaces in centuries. His chambers were fortresses, seats of power, places of cold efficiency. They were not homes. The blanket was also warm. Not just from Beth's body heat, but actually warm, as if it had been heated somehow. Valen realized she must have brought it from the palace staff quarters, where she probably kept it near a heating unit. She had brought her own personal blanket, from her own room, to cover an Emperor she barely knew. But she was not finished. Beth pulled a small cushioned stool from the corner of the room, the kind servants used when performing detailed cleaning work. She positioned it quietly beside the rest platform and sat down. Then she did something that defied all logic, all protocol, all reasonable behavior for a servant in the presence of the most dangerous being in 70-star systems. She began to hum. The melody was soft, barely louder than a whisper. It was a simple tune, the kind that repeated every few bars, easy to follow but pleasant to hear. Valen did not recognize the specific song, but he recognized its purpose. It was a lullaby. This human woman was singing a lullaby to an alien emperor who was pretending to sleep. The sound filled the normally silent chamber with something Valen had not heard in his private spaces for longer than he could remember. Music. Not the formal ceremonial music played at state functions, not the military anthems that accompanied his public appearances. Just a simple, gentle song meant to bring comfort and peace. Valen's heart beat faster, but for an entirely different reason than before. The melody stirred memories he had buried deep. His own mother had sung to him once, millennia ago, before duty and warfare had consumed his life. The songs had been different, in a language dead for centuries, but the purpose had been the same. Someone who cared about him had wanted him to feel safe enough to rest. When was the last time anyone had cared whether he rested well? When was the last time someone had thought about his comfort rather than his commands? His servants maintained his quarters to perfection because they feared punishment, not because they worried about his well-being. His advisors monitored his health because the empire needed its ruler functional, not because they cared about him as an individual being. But this human, this Beth, daughter of Dorothy, had seen his cold chamber and thought he might need warmth. She had seen him lying alone and thought he might need comfort. She had discovered his grief and thought he might need compassion. The lullaby continued, soft and steady. Valen found himself actually relaxing under the worn blanket, his muscles releasing tension he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. The temperature in the room had not changed, but somehow he felt warmer. The darkness had not lifted, but somehow the space felt less oppressive. Beth hummed for perhaps 10 minutes, maybe more. Valen lost track of time, something that almost never happened to him. His mind, usually racing with strategic calculations and political considerations, went quiet. For those few minutes, he was not an emperor. He was just a being, resting beneath a blanket, listening to a simple song. When Beth finally stopped humming, she sat in silence for another moment. Then she stood up, picked up her stool, and returned it to the corner without making a sound. She gathered her cleaning supplies and packed them carefully into her bag. Before leaving, she looked back at the rest platform one more time. She adjusted the blanket slightly, making sure it had not shifted. Then she whispered words so soft that Valen almost missed them. "Sleep well." The door opened and closed. Beth was gone. And Emperor Valen lay perfectly still, wrapped in a threadbare human blanket, feeling something he had not felt in 300 years. A single tear rolled down his scaled face. Valen remained motionless for several minutes after Beth left, still processing what had just happened. The blanket remained draped over him, its warmth seeping into scales that had not felt such comfort in longer than he could calculate. His test had been designed to reveal deception, theft, disrespect. Instead, it had revealed something he had not anticipated and did not know how to categorize. Kindness. Simple, uncomplicated kindness from someone who had no reason to offer it. The Emperor was about to rise when he heard the door open again. His body tensed immediately. Beth had returned. Through his biosenses, he detected her familiar heartbeat, slightly elevated but steady. She moved quietly back into the chamber, and Valen resumed his sleeping facade, curious about why she had come back. Beth walked to the same corner where she had sat before and settled down on the floor, her back against the wall. Valen heard the rustle of paper, then the soft scratch of something writing. She had brought a notebook and pen. For several minutes, she simply wrote in silence while the Emperor watched through barely open eyes, wondering what could be so important that she would risk returning to his chamber. Then Beth began to read what she had written, her voice barely above a whisper. She was reading aloud to herself, the way some humans did when reviewing their words. That was how Valen came to hear something not meant for his ears. "Dear Mom," Beth read softly. "I finished my first solo shift in the Emperor's rest chamber tonight. I know you were worried about me handling it alone, but everything went fine. Please do not stress about work while you are recovering. Your health is more important than any cleaning shift." She paused, pen hovering over paper, then continued writing and reading. "Mom, I need to tell you something, but please do not worry. The Emperor looks tired. Not just regular tired, but the kind of exhausted that settles into bones. I saw it in his face before he went to sleep. There are stress lines around his eyes that were not there in the official portraits from even 5 years ago." Valen felt a jolt of surprise. She had studied his portraits? She had noticed changes in his appearance? No one paid attention to such details. He was the Emperor, an eternal constant, unchanging and unchangeable. People feared him or obeyed him, but they did not observe him closely enough to notice stress lines. Beth kept writing. "I wish someone would tell him to eat more. I know that sounds ridiculous, me worrying about the most powerful being in the galaxy, but I saw his meal tray from earlier. He barely touched the food. And his rest chamber is kept so cold, Mom. Way too cold. I checked the environmental controls when I was cleaning near them. The temperature is set 15 degrees below standard comfort levels for his species." She was right. Valen had lowered the temperature decades ago and never thought about it again. Cold kept him alert, kept him sharp. Or at least, that is what he had told himself. In truth, he could not remember why he had made that choice. It had simply become another aspect of his existence that no one questioned. "I am going to try something," Beth continued writing, her voice taking on a determined tone. "I am going to adjust the temperature up by 2 degrees each week. Just a little bit at a time, so hopefully he will not notice or think it is a malfunction. Maybe he kept it this cold because someone set it that way once and he just got used to it. Maybe no one ever asked if he wanted it warmer. I know I could get in serious trouble for changing imperial settings without permission, but Mom, I cannot just leave things this way when I can see he is uncomfortable." Valen's breath caught. She was planning to risk punishment to make his chamber more comfortable. She had noticed his discomfort before he had noticed it himself. Beth's writing continued, and her tone shifted to something more melancholic. "The saddest part of tonight was seeing his memory crystals. One activated by accident, and I saw a recording of a child. His child, I think, based on the resemblance. She looked so happy, so full of life. But I have never heard anyone mention the Emperor having family. I asked one of the senior staff about it once, and they said never to bring it up. That means something terrible must have happened." She stopped writing and just sat quietly for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "How lonely it must be to rule an entire empire with no one to talk to honestly. Everyone around him is terrified. The servants avoid eye contact. The advisors speak in careful political language. The guards stand at attention like statues. Who does he talk to when he is tired? Who does he share his worries with? Who reminds him that he is more than just an emperor, that he is a person who needs rest and warmth and comfort like every other living being? Those words hit Valen like a physical blow. In all his centuries of rule, no one had ever asked those questions. No one had wondered about his emotional needs or his personal well-being. They cared about the empire's stability, about political outcomes, about military victories. But who cared about him as an individual? The answer was obvious and devastating. Nobody. I know what it is like to feel alone, Beth wrote, her pen moving slower now. After Dad died, I watched Mom carry all her grief in silence because she thought she had to be strong for me. I was only 12, but I could see how much it hurt her to have no one to share her pain with. The Emperor reminds me of her in those days. Someone carrying an impossible weight with no one to help hold it. She closed her notebook and wiped her eyes. Then she did something that made Valen's carefully constructed emotional walls finally crumble. She looked directly at where he lay on the rest platform, seemingly asleep beneath her blanket, and she spoke to him as if he could hear her. I hope you have good dreams tonight, Your Majesty. I hope you dream about your daughter, and I hope those dreams bring you peace instead of pain. Everyone deserves that much, even emperors. Especially emperors. Beth stood up, tucked her notebook into her pocket, and left the chamber for the second and final time that night. Emperor Valen lay in the darkness, a blanket he had not asked for wrapped around his shoulders, and wept. Not silently, not with the control he had maintained for centuries. He wept the way a parent weeps for a lost child, the way a being weeps when they realize how isolated they have become, the way anyone weeps when they finally understand that they have been drowning and someone has just noticed. When morning light filtered through the crystalline walls of his rest chamber, Emperor Valen stood before the massive windows overlooking his capital city. The blanket still draped across his shoulders, worn and out of place against his formal sleeping robes. Below him, millions of beings from hundreds of species began their daily routines, each one living under his rule, each one seeing him as a distant, untouchable force of power. He had not slept after Beth left. Instead, he had spent the remaining hours of darkness thinking about her words, about her tears for his loss, about her concern for his comfort. Such a small gesture, bringing a blanket to someone who looked cold. Such a simple act, humming a lullaby to help someone rest. Yet these tiny moments of human compassion had accomplished what 1,000 years of ruling could not. They had reminded him what he had lost when he became an emperor and stopped being a person. Valen activated his communications array and summoned his head advisor, a stern official named Korath who had served the empire for 60 years. The advisor arrived within minutes, his face showing concern at being called so early. His expression shifted to confusion when he saw the human blanket still wrapped around the emperor's frame. Your Majesty, is everything well? Has there been a security breach? Sit down, Korath, Valen said quietly. We need to discuss significant changes. Over the next hour, Valen outlined a series of reforms that left his advisor speechless. The emperor wanted new protocols established immediately. Every servant in the imperial palace would receive quarters with proper heating, lighting, and space. Their wages would triple. They would be given regular days off and access to the same medical facilities used by government officials. Any supervisor caught mistreating staff would face immediate dismissal. But Your Majesty, Korath protested carefully, servants have always been background personnel. These changes would cost enormous resources and require complete restructuring of palace operations. Background personnel, Valen repeated, his voice cold. Is that what we call the people who maintain our lives? The people who clean our spaces, prepare our food, ensure our comfort? They are invisible to us only because we choose not to see them. He told Korath about Beth's observations, though he did not mention the pretended sleep or the blanket. He explained how a young human had noticed things about his well-being that his entire advisory council had missed. She had seen his stress, his exhaustion, his discomfort in an overchilled room. She had cared enough to worry about whether he was eating properly. When did we stop noticing each other? Valen asked. When did we become so focused on power and protocol that we forgot the simple act of caring whether someone is cold? Korath had no answer to that. The reforms began immediately. Valen established the Imperial Well-Being Initiative, a new department focused entirely on the quality of life for every palace employee. He appointed Dorothy, once she recovered from her illness, as the first director of staff services, a newly created position with significant authority. Her daughter Beth became her deputy, despite having worked at the palace for less than a year. The announcement shocked the entire court. Elevating servants to positions of actual power violated centuries of tradition. Several high-ranking officials submitted formal protests. Valen rejected every single one. When Dorothy and Beth were brought before him for their first official meeting, Valen saw Beth's eyes widen with recognition. She knew. Somehow, she understood that he had been awake that night, that he had witnessed everything. Her face flushed, and she looked ready to apologize or possibly resign in embarrassment. Director Dorothy, Deputy Beth, Valen addressed them formally. Your first assignment is to teach this court something they have forgotten. I want you to develop training programs on what you call compassion and practical kindness. Every official, every advisor, every guard will attend. They will learn that noticing someone's discomfort and caring about their well-being is not weakness. It is fundamental decency. Dorothy bowed respectfully, but Beth spoke up, her voice tentative. Your Majesty, may I ask a question? You may. Why now? What changed? Valen considered his answer carefully. He could not tell her everything, could not reveal that he had been pretending to sleep. But he could tell her the truth that mattered. Someone reminded me that leaders need care as much as anyone else, he said quietly. Someone showed me that simple kindness costs nothing but means everything. Someone noticed I was cold. Beth's eyes filled with tears, understanding completely. The changes rippled outward from the palace into the broader empire. Within 3 months, Valen established similar well-being initiatives across all imperial facilities. Within 6 months, other alien governments began sending delegations to study these reforms. Within a year, the Karath Empire's reputation across the galaxy shifted fundamentally. Ambassadors who came expecting the usual displays of military might found themselves in meetings where the Emperor asked about their comfort, offered them warm drinks, and genuinely listened to their concerns. Trade negotiations that once happened in cold conference rooms now took place in spaces designed for actual comfort. The Emperor who had ruled through fear and power began ruling through strength tempered with wisdom. Other species began approaching humanity differently. If humans could teach the galaxy's most fearsome Emperor about compassion, what else might they offer? Human cultural advisors became highly sought across multiple governments. The concept of checking in on someone's well-being became a diplomatic standard. Simple gestures of care became as important as military alliances. Beth's mother often asked her what had happened that night in the Emperor's chamber. Beth never told her the complete truth. Some moments were too sacred to share, even with family. But she did tell her mother one thing. I just saw someone who looked tired and cold, Mom. So I did what you taught me. I tried to help. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the Karath Empire, they would point to policy changes and governmental reforms. They would analyze economic data and diplomatic records. But they would miss the real turning point, the moment when everything changed. That moment happened in a dark chamber, when a young human woman gave a lonely emperor a worn blanket and sang him a lullaby. When she cried for his loss and worried about his comfort. When she saw past his power to his pain and chose kindness over fear. The blanket itself remained in Valen's private quarters, folded carefully and kept in a place of honor. On difficult days, when the weight of empire felt too heavy, he would hold it and remember. Remember that even the mightiest rulers need someone to notice they are cold. Remember that small acts of human compassion can reshape galaxies. Remember that sometimes, the most powerful thing in the universe is someone who simply cares.